Good evening and welcome to, well, a group of bookstores are presenting this evening with Amor Towles in celebration of the Lincoln Highway. Amor is joined in conversation by John Grisham. The stores who are presenting tonight are Warwick's in La Jolla, Diesel in Brentwood and Del Mar, Auntie's in Spokane, and Elliott Bay in Seattle, and then Rakestraw Books here in Danville. It's a pleasure to have all of you here this evening. It's a pleasure to introduce two writers who need almost no introduction, but we'll say Amor and John Grisham both write stories that readers love and that booksellers love selling. So it is a thrill to have them here this evening as we celebrate the Lincoln Highway. If you have questions, type them into chat, and Julie from Warwick's will be back in about half an hour to start pulling those in. We may not get to all the questions, but we will give it our best shot. So thanks for being here, everybody. Amor Towles and John Grisham.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. And John, first I want to say that I know this is true of you, John. Normally I've spoken in 4 of these 5 stores. And so it is a little bit bittersweet to be speaking through this 2-dimensional medium instead of in the presence of readers and surrounded by the books and in the company of the booksellers. But the positive, of course, is that I get to do it with you, John, which I wouldn't get to do if I was there in person, in one of the stores. But I really want to thank you for joining me tonight in this conversation.
Happy to be here. We've done this once before. I can't remember the book, but it was a virtual thing last year sometime. And then we first met in Brooklyn 3 or 4 years ago at a book gig I was doing for Camino Island. You stopped by the store, there's an old church, I think, and we had a wonderful book event then. So we go back several years and always have a good time, enjoy talking about books. And the virtual thing is bittersweet. We would prefer to be there in person to meet the readers and fans and see the bookstores. That's what I love about traveling, is to see the bookstores. But at the same time, the virtual stuff allows us to cover a lot of territory, go to more stores, and bounce from coast to coast, and hang out with each other virtually, which is difficult to do, as you know, in real time. So it's good and bad, but let's make the most of it. And we're here, so we're going to have some fun.
Excellent.
So the role tonight, it's your book. You came out 2 days ago, October the 5th. So I'm the moderator. I'm going to be like Johnny Carson or Dick Cavett or whoever, the old-fashioned Jay Leno. I get to be the moderator, the host tonight. Right. And I get to grill you about your book and talk about your book and stuff like that. So let's make sure we have the roles defined. Okay.
Okay. Understood. Yeah. You should be as ruthless as you need to be.
Well, not with a book like this. I spent the afternoon plowing through the stuff online, just accumulating all of the wonderful reviews in the past week for this book, The Lincoln Highway. The reviews are fantastic. I mean, from New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, NPR, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus. It's a total smackdown rave review. Don't tell me you don't read reviews, because I always say I don't read reviews because mine are not nearly as good, but you got to be pleased with the launch.
Yeah, I am. And of course, the Wall Street Journal panned it. They're 2 for 2 on this one. But I of course, the reviewers, it's nice to have them be positive about the book, but I'd much rather, it's nice to start getting the feedback from the readers. And of course, and I know you feel the same way. I'd much rather have readers find that the book is engaging and satisfying than to have the reviewers, who I respect, have it ring a bell for them. And so it is, now as you know, you in the modern era, you put a book out and you may receive emails from readers in 48 hours, in 72 hours, and people, beginning to share their impressions of it. And it's nice to see that the book seems to be, so far in this very early stage, well received by readers.
Yeah, and with good reason. I learned years ago to try to ignore reviewers because it's just, life is better when you ignore the critics. And you know, I don't write for the critics.
Right.
I hopefully write for the people who enjoy reading books. And you and I talked about this before. You know, I aspire to write hopefully a high quality of popular fiction. That's what I'm trying to write. I'm not trying to write books that folks are going to be reading 100 years from now. I'll be long dead by then. And if I write the books that people enjoy and it's proven in the marketplace, then that's certainly enough for me. And I think you feel the same way when you write a book like The Lincoln Highway, that's just an old-fashioned storytelling at its best, and we'll get to that in a minute. And to see it well received in the marketplace is also very gratifying.
Yeah, you know, you raise an interesting, a serious topic that for me, which is that when I was in college in the 1980s, and I went to Yale, the received wisdom in the community, the academic community at the time, and among my peers, was that the best art, whether it was painting or music or film or literature, the best art, you know, never considered its audience. You know, that was just received wisdom at the time, you know, and that, you know, the impenetrability of James Joyce was a positive, and the more avant-garde the music, that was a positive, and you know, to see a befuddling Italian film, that was a positive. And I believed it too. Wow. And it seems sort of something, you know, real badge of honor to be creating art without any interest in the audience. But now in retrospect, you know, as someone who's in my 50s now, in retrospect, and as someone who studied the history of culture in the West, it's a crazy notion, right? I mean, for hundreds and hundreds of years, no artist would have ever thought that made sense. You know, the Renaissance painters consider their audience very carefully. Dickens and Tolstoy, even Dostoevsky, you know, consider their audience very carefully. And I think it is very healthy for an artist to craft the work as best they can, following their own instincts. But then the way I like to do it is the first draft I do for myself, and it can be as crazy and as misguided as possible. But when I start to edit, I do want to edit with some imaginary reader in mind. And I think that's a very healthy back and forth, is to imagine who out there is going to read this and take the time and spend the money to buy this book. They deserve something which is carefully constructed, thoughtfully written, carefully edited, not cliche laden, and to be engaging. And you know, so that I kind of come around into sort of that view myself, the one you're talking about.
So you touched on the question that fascinates readers and fascinates prospective writers in the process. You talked about your first draft, and obviously with a book every 5 years, you take your time, which is certainly wonderful. I learned a long time ago, I have a hard time working slow, and that's not always a good thing. But let's probe that a moment. How do you once you start, what's the process, and why does it take you 5 years?
Yeah. So for me, and we may overlap in this part, but I mean, for me, I've been writing since I was a kid. I've always wanted to write fiction, even though there was a period of my life where I wasn't doing it actively, but it's always been my interest and my dream. And I spent a lot of time doing it. And so over the course of my life, what happens is I will be struck by a notion, a conceit, a premise, like, you know, a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time, you know, and literally that was the beginning of A Gentleman in Moscow, having just sort of this one sentence notion like that. And when a notion like that grabs me, what tends to happen is that very quickly, and I mean like within 72 hours, it starts to fill out in greater detail. You know, and in that case, I'm like, oh, it's going to be in Russia. He's going to be an aristocrat. It'll, be in the beginning of the Soviet era. He'll be sentenced to house arrest in a grand hotel in Moscow. And, and it starts to, and the book's going to be 30 years in length. I'm going to cover the whole Soviet expanse, and we're going to live with him in the hotel, et cetera. And I can start to think of it in those terms. And then from there, which is kind of like a scaffolding, then I really start to dig in my imagination. And I'll spend a couple of years, I like to call it design, where I try to imagine the whole story in every detail, the settings, the people, the events, put them in order in a detailed outline, all before I start chapter one. So if you take the case of the Lincoln Highway, it's very similar. And then I started many years ago with this notion of, I had this idea of a kid coming home from a juvenile work camp where he'd been sent because of a mistake he made, and the warden driving him, back to the family farm, and saying, you've paid your debt to society, and what happened was a freak accident, and you're a good person. You should start your life anew. And that's the kid's intention. But it turns out that two other kids, friends of his from the juvenile work camp, have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. And that's kind of this notion I had, the two kids in the trunk of the car. And then, like, as I said, in the case of Joe in Moscow, very quickly, in a matter of, a day or two, I was like, oh, it's definitely going to be a farm in the Midwest that they're going back to. And, he's going to be an honorable kid raised on a farm, and his dad's not going to be a very good farmer, and the home's going to be in foreclosure. And one of the kids in the trunk is going to be a kind of a rougher kid from New York, a fast talker type. And it's going to be a 10-day story, and it's going to be in the 1950s. I don't know where all that comes from, but I start with these sort of instincts. And then, as I say, I spent a couple of years imagining that in greater and greater detail, writing in notebooks by hand. And then I make the transition to an outline, and then I'm in, and then I start the process of writing the book. And that takes me a couple of years. So yes, it is, in my case, a time-consuming process.
You also told me you do something that's pretty strange. Once you finish the book, you set it aside for a long period of time and just let it sit there and kind of ferment, right?
Yeah, I like to, and that's kind of it's a two-step thing for me at that point, John, because as I think some of our listeners may not know, I'm not a research-driven, writer. I don't pick a topic, research it, and write a book. What I'll do is pick a topic that is in an arena that I have a long-standing interest in. So I didn't, research New York in the 30s and rules of civility. I was a fan of the 30s since I was a teenager. And that familiarity is what I used to invent that book. And similar with the Russian era, similar with the 50s, although that's certainly a closer period. But so when I finish the draft, what I like to do is kind of set it down, as you say. I don't share until the draft is fully done and clean and in a shape that I like. Then I'll share it with 5 people kind of on the same day. And I'll ask them to get back to me, in kind of like, 2 months. And then I have sort of this quiet period where, I'm not working on it, and I'm waiting to hear what they say. And I'm beginning to think about it myself. What are the strengths and weaknesses of it? What are the things that were bugging me about it? How might it be improved? And one of the things I do during that phase is then I actually do some research then. Having not done research before the book or during the book, I'll take this sort of moment when it's done, and I'll have a list of things that I kind of want to investigate. And in the case of the Lincoln Highway, because this book takes place over 10 days in 1954, in June, I was like, you know what? I should go find what happened on the front page of the New York Times for those 10 days in June of 1954. So I went and got the front page of each of those, 10 days. And that process is always fascinating, because sometimes you're like, oh, it was an aspects of what's in the news that you feel like, oh, the book is exactly right on, in terms of some of the themes or the tenor of things. Sometimes there's a piece of information where you're like, wow, like I had no idea. And then I may want to integrate that into the story and as a part of the revision. And that happened in this case. There was a news story, I think it was on the 3rd day of the 10 days, where on the front page of the New York Times, the headline said, tomorrow, a nuclear simulation will be held in 40 cities across the nation. And for 10 minutes, all activity in all 40 cities will stop simultaneously. And I'm like, what? That is the craziest thing. So then you kind of flip to the next day to see what happened. And there's the headline saying, the simulation went well. 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on the city of New York, one in Phoenix, one in Chicago, all across the country. And all activity in Manhattan ceased. I think it was like at 10 a.m. And there's a picture of Times Square totally empty except for a single cop, no cars moving, no people on the streets, and you can imagine no telephones ringing, no cash registers ringing, nobody coming out of the movie theater there in Times Square. It's just completely vacant. And I was like, oh man, this is too good. This belongs in the book, particularly because Times Square was already featured in my novel. And the Lincoln Highway, which is the first highway that crossed America, it was built in 1913, 14, 15, began in Times Square and ended in San Francisco. And I thought, what an amazing thing. I've written this book where they're headed to Times Square, and that's where the Lincoln Highway began. And here is this crazy moment in history. So I did weave that into the story. And then and I weave the newspaper article into the story. And then I was like, do you include the picture or not? You know, this crazy picture. And I was so impressed by the picture. I was like, yeah, of course you can include the picture. Photograph goes in, you know, so you call the New York Times and say, hey, can I have that picture? And for 50, you know what it was, for $150, you can put the picture in your book, you know, whatever, something crazy like that. But so yes, I know. So there is this moment after the first draft is done and the heavy lifting is behind me. And I really enjoy that process where you start to ask yourself, how can I make this book better? What little things can I add? What things can I take out that are weighing it down? You know, how can I sharpen the language in various spaces to really, you know, try to make the book the best it can be?
How long have you known about the history of the Lincoln Highway?
Well, that's a funny one because I hadn't, oh, wait, you know, I'll show you something. Hold on one second. I mean, it's right here. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. So when I'm talking about these notebooks, when I'm planning the book, so this is, where is it? Oh yeah, here it is. Like, so, you know, this is what a book might look like, you know, for me. That's it. I'll hold it up. So, you know, it says Lincoln Highway, you know, and whatever that is, that's July 2017. You know, it's handwritten, you know, whatever. It's handwritten notes. But so this is the first book for the Lincoln Highway. And you can see reading backwards, what it says is unfinished business 2014, because that's what the Lincoln Highway was called when I began taking notes, you know, in 2014, whatever, 7 years ago. And I had never heard of the Lincoln Highway at that point. Everything in the book that happens now, the main events happened at that in these notes then. It was the same idea, the same trip, the same 10 days, the same characters. But by the time I kind of was getting very close to starting the book, I knew they were going to drive from Nebraska to New York City. I knew that one of the main character's mother had gone west from Nebraska many years ago and abandoned the family. But I'd never really written down what the road was that either one was going to take. And I had a map of the Midwest out in front of me, and I'm looking at it to determine, okay, when they leave the farm, which way are they going to go and which highway? And I'm thinking, it's going to be route whatever. And I see Route 30 and I'm like, yeah, that's probably the right road. But then I noticed in very small print, it says, you know, formerly known as the Lincoln Highway. And I was like, oh, what is that? And that's a rabbit hole that I did go down. So then, of course, it turns out that, you know, as soon as I look into it, that yes, the Lincoln Highway was the first highway to cross America. In 1910, the federal government was not involved in highways. They were not interested in them. All roads grew out of the metropolitan centers. And so they were focused on going from the train station, in essence, and the financial center out to the farms and residences. But they weren't really focused on going from, say, Chicago to Denver. You know, the trains did that, the roads didn't. And so this individual, Carl Fisher, who was a car fanatic, he was rich, he was a patriot, said there should be a road that crosses America. And he raised money from the public. He threw in his own money. He got money from Thomas Edison and Teddy Roosevelt and from Boy Scouts, raised money across the country. And he oversaw the construction of a highway that went from Times Square to San Francisco. It was a private venture, and anyone could use it. It wasn't a toll road. It was just sort of a gift to the nation in essence. And so that Americans could see the country. And this was really the first major highway. And so I'm reading this, having designed this story where they're going to go from Times Square, they're going to Times Square, going to California. And you know, and I was like, oh my God, this occasionally happens. It's like a gift from heaven, right? This crazy fact of history that fit right in like the final piece in a puzzle on my table. And so immediately I changed the title of the book from Unfinished Business to the Lincoln Highway. We were off to the races.
Well, it's a much better title. I had never heard of the Lincoln Highway, and you hadn't either, right? As a longtime New Yorker, you had never heard of the Lincoln Highway.
Never. And you know, here, because what happened is, not to get in too deep into it, it's not, you know, but it's kind of fascinating stuff, but is eventually the federal government did get interested in highways. And so, but not long after, the Lincoln Highway was such a success. It was the most well-known road in America. It was before Route 66. Everybody in America knew what it was. The federal government realized that there was value to these roads, so they took over the process and they created the numbered system, which had not existed. And so when they did that, they went and said, we're going to take over segments of the Lincoln Highway across the country to become Route 30 or in Illinois and in Nebraska and other route numbers in other states. And so it kind of got co-opted. But the other thing is the Lincoln Highway, as the first highway in the country, it's not a 4-lane road with gas stations and rest stops, right? It's basically, it's what they called in my hometown a road, car going one way, car going the other, long straight stretch through farmlands is what a lot of the Lincoln Highway is still today. So you can go drive it, but you got to get off the 4-lane road highway. You got to kind of, work your way off into the countryside a little bit, and you can go all the way across the country on the Lincoln Highway today. But I had never heard of it. And to be honest, in every time I've talked about it, I think probably only 1 in 1,000 people has said, I know what that is. And it's because they live on it.
They live on it. Yeah. Yeah. I never heard of it, but but it's still there, still in good shape. You can still drive from Times Square to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Did you do that?
When I finished the book, the first draft, that's one of the things I did. Just like when I finished the first draft of The Gentleman in Moscow, I went and stayed in the Metropole Hotel because I had never spent a night there. And I figured if I'm going to write a whole book about it, I should go spend the night there. So I did that, flew to Moscow. But so here I finished this. I flew out to Nebraska. I drove a car out into a small town called Aurora, which is kind of the model for where the book begins, and then began working my way back east, like the characters, which was a great fun. And again, it kind of affects a little bit my process of rethinking how to revise the book and what I might add or what I might take away.
Well, the reason I ask that, road trips are such a rich part of American culture, history, heritage, and literary culture.
Yes.
You think about On the Road, Jack Kerouac and John Steinbeck, Travels with Charlie, and all these great roads. This is America. We love to hit the open road. There's so many. The country's so big. There's so many great roads you can, and I was going to ask you, do you have a favorite road trip? Do you and your wife do something or as a kid, you and your family take a road trip? Do you have a favorite road trip?
That is interesting. Do I have a favorite? I did, I did the classic across the country at the age of 19 with a friend in a hatchback or whatever, and went across north and back south and loved that experience, because you kind of might know somebody, a distant cousin or a friend of a friend, or and kind of stop in Chicago with somebody and stop in Denver with somebody else. But I loved driving. I really do love driving. But you're absolutely right. Of course, the road is the journey has been a part of storytelling since almost the beginning. We think of like the Odyssey is obviously a journey story. The Aeneid is a journey story, but it just so happens that those are on water. But the Americans clearly took that journey tradition and really made it their own in the form of road and book stories. And probably my favorite actually road book in America is As I Lay Dying, which is which is funny because I didn't even think about it when I read it as a kid, but I think about it a lot now. That book, Faulkner, one of Faulkner's greatest works, is about, the kids of a woman dies and she wanted to be buried in her hometown. And so the kids take the coffin, put it in the trunk, and they go, and they're going through the South in a horse and wagon, and all kinds of, misadventure occurs on the route between the family farm and the mother's hometown. And so anyway, but as you say, they're out there, they're a part of the American story, and it makes sense, right? Because we are a nation as a nation of immigrants, really from the beginning, setting aside the Native American population, and with great, I don't mean to set them aside in any disrespect, but in the tradition of the Westerners the Western Europeans who came here, that they were always moving. They would land in, on Plymouth Rock and just start heading, west, and they, hit, the western ends of Massachusetts and stopped. And then the next generation came and you went out to the Mississippi, and then another generation came, or 2 generations later, and they kept pushing west. And so that ongoing motion is obviously built into the narrative of the nation in a serious way.
Let's talk a bit about the story without giving too much away.
Yeah.
You start off in rural Nebraska in 1954. You start off with a kid named Emmett, who is being released from reform school for a reform prison or whatever, for prison for juvies, we call it juvies, for committing a crime that was not that serious, but it had serious consequences. And he is being driven back to his family farm by the warden, who's a good guy. And he's going home because his father has died and the family farm has been mortgaged and they're foreclosing, they're losing the farm. And his little brother, Billy, is waiting on him. And they plan to get in Emmett's 1948 Studebaker and hit the Lincoln Highway and go to San Francisco and try to find their mother, who left them 8 years earlier for reasons we're not really ever sure of. But they want to find their mom because their dad died. And that's the setup. And so right off the bat, things do not go as planned. In fact, they never make it anywhere near 1 mile to the west. It all happens to the east, back toward New York. So kind of pick up from there and give us the skeletal framework of the story without divulging too much.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And of course, as I think the listeners can figure out, the reason they're going in the wrong direction is because of the two guys in the trunk that we were talking about earlier. And so suddenly you have this group of three 18-year-old boys roughly and an 8-year-old boy moving in the wrong direction from Emmett and Billy's standpoint, but in the right direction from Willie and Duchess's standpoint, because they have their own mission and their own idea that they've hatched of how to get money that they feel Willie deserves, that is his money that is rightfully his, that they need to go claim, and they're going to split it 3 ways, and it's going to be a grand old thing. And so you kind of have this, they're getting tugged in the wrong direction by the intentions of Duchess and Willie. And the whole story is 10 days, and you're moving. You spend 2 days in Nebraska, then you start moving, and you keep moving towards New York, and they get split up. They come back together. They run into other people who pose threats or who provide help. You have the classic in a picaresque sense. You're interacting with people, but I think that and moving towards this destination, and kind of, I think thematically, we talk about these American road stories, and one of the great things about the road stories is that a road can be many, many things, right? The road, as a metaphor, is setting out to go someplace new. We have many stories that are versions of that. It can be about coming home, and we have stories that are, well, that's what the road is. It's trying to get back home so not the future, it's the past where I'm going. The road can be where fateful things happen, like to Oedipus or to Robert Johnson running into the devil at the crossroads, and it can be, a place where the road itself is the whole story. Where, like in Jack Kerouac, it's what happens along the road that matters. And so we've taken the road and turned it into these different things. In the case of this book, I think that what is most closely aligned thematically with the road and the events is that it's really about being 18 or 19. And I think, we think about our lives from 0 to 16, we're being fed almost, but we're getting all kinds of information and guidance from our parents, from school, from our church, from the community around us. We're told stories, we're given guidance, we're given rules, we're given advice. We're told what we should aspire to do and what we shouldn't do ever, and how we should behave towards others. All this information is coming towards us in the form of stories and rules and all kinds of things, patterns of behavior. But you get to like 16 or 17, 18, and there's sort of suddenly this awareness, and for the young person, they're really saying, wait a second, I kind of can make these decisions myself. The future is mine to evaluate, and my identity is something I can form. Morality is something that I can judge, and so they look back on all this information they've been giving, and some of it they accept and as good, some of it they reject, some of it they're conscious of, and some of it they're not. But they also are starting to invent their own viewpoints based on their instincts, based on their personality, based on their experiences that they've been having now as they're becoming young adults. And the future is kind of defined by that pivoting moment where these young people sort of start to take control of deciding who they are and what they're capable of and what they should pursue. And that's what this book is about. In as much as it's a journey, and it's only 10 days, hopefully what you get is in this concentrated form as a window on this moment where these young people are going through that kind of a transition.
It's also some wonderful storytelling because I tell aspiring students or aspiring writers, you have to have strong major characters. Your protagonists have to be very strong people, but your supporting cast is crucial. And oftentimes you have to have really good bad guys. You don't have any really bad guys in this story, but you have an amazing cast of characters that these four kids bump into along the road, whether it's on the train where Emmett and Billy get stuck trying to find their car in New York that's been stolen by Duchess and Willie. But some of the hobos they meet on the train, good and bad.
Yeah.
Some of the scenes that you write about in New York City are just breathtaking and hilarious, and also extremely colorful. I mean, you had to. You say you're not much for research, but the research seems to be pretty authentic. The story seems very authentic.
And I think it does, and it is because of drawing on something that I feel comfortable with already. And as whether the idea of they eventually go to see an author who is a hero of Billy's. It's an older guy who works in the Empire State Building, and that's sort of an environment that feels very natural for me to tell. The great thing about that on the road across in the freight train, there's a scene in a boxcar that you're mentioning. There's a scene in a Pullman car, and I feel that we kind of all to some degree know what those two things are like, and they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And we know who's in the boxcar, the empty boxcar, and which is dusty and made out of wood, and with a rattling door and a hatch on the top. We can kind of all visualize that. And then you have the Pullman car, which we've seen at least in the films, or and we know that crazy notion of this, sort of this fancy, almost like a living room on wheels, and so I try to take something like that it's both accessible to me, but hopefully it's accessible to the reader, and then you populate it with the idiosyncrasy of the individuals. I've been thinking a lot lately about your comment about the characters and the importance of characters that you in your advice that you give sort of reminded me of this. I think about the role of history in my work, and the role of, because I've written books and set in different times and places, and the role of history in my work really, I think, is like the painted backdrop at the back of a stage. If you had a Chekhov play and you're doing the cherry orchard, and through the French doors in the distance, you can see the cherry trees in bloom or whatever. That's like a painting that they've hung from the back, and it's painted just well enough to add to give the illusion that it's out there. So in front of that painted backdrop, you have plywood shelves that have been painted to look like mahogany, and a flimsy door that's been painted to look like mahogany, and the door leads nowhere basically. And and you have fake books in the bookshelves, sort of this artifice of the stage. In front of that, though, you have a real table with real chairs, and a real set of a tea service, China tea service, and that's where the action happens. Right, is that the characters are gathered around that table, and they confront each other, and they exchange their sentiments and their ideas. And when someone makes a point by slapping their hand on the table, it's got to sound like that, feel like that. And when somebody sets their cup down impatiently, it's got to sound like that to us. And so for me, this is the layers of my work, or I think maybe of all novels, which is that some aspects are just the painted backdrop. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be perfectly historically researched. They have to sort of just add to the illusion. But what you have to really get right is the interaction of these individuals around the table, because that's really, I think, what, as you were saying, the advice you give, that's what the readers are going to be focused on. Just as when you go to the theater, if the action between the actors and what they have to say and how they're behaving is compelling, everything else kind of fades a little bit, And whereas if it's not working, you're staring at the chandelier and you're wondering when you can go have dinner, So I do think that the creation of characters that grip people is central. And I think you're right that the secondary characters need to be taken with just as much care, sometimes with more care, because you have less time to say who they are and what they're like, and they may be playing a critical role. And so you have to craft them very carefully to bring them fully to life, even though they have less space in which to do so.
Does dialogue come easy for you? It sounds easy for you. And it's not always easy. And in fact, if you think dialogue is easy, you can read a lot of books where the dialogue is not true. It's not real. It's not
It doesn't
authentic.
work.
And you realize this person, people don't talk that way. Okay. And so I'm always, when I'm writing dialogue, I type it, then I say it out loud and I repeat it. Do you struggle with it? It doesn't, I mean, it doesn't appear as though you do, but how difficult is it?
It is not difficult for me when I'm doing it, but that's because the difficult work has already been done by the time I'm writing dialogue usually, which means that I know the people. And most importantly, I know what they sound like to me. The reader may say, I'm not successful at this or not, but what I am trying to do is to in my head, hear the people well enough that I can hear the exchange. And that means, that means that, they may be using a different kind of vocabulary from each other. They have a different type of syntax potentially from each other. One may be, impatient as a characteristic and a little bit vain. The other may be, slow in the way they respond, very thoughtful and sympathetic as an individual. And you want that to come when you can hear that in the way they express themselves, then it comes easy. You know what I mean? Because they almost take over. I have to set up what is the exchange about, or why are they having the exchange, and then hopefully the characters can do a lot of the work, for me in essence. But it never works if I don't know what they sound like to begin with, because then it's just, as you say, you're kind of putting together things people might say, but to the reader it doesn't sound like a conversation, like a real conversation.
Yeah, it's always a challenge for me when you're writing any kind of scene, how much background, how much backfilling do you do for your reader about a certain character,
yes,
as opposed to how much action you show that reader through dialogue, because
Yeah.
you get to know the character through dialogue, and if the dialogue is true, if it's working, okay.
Yeah.
And you read some books where they go for 2 pages describing a character, and then the guy finally speaks and it makes no sense. I mean, there's always a balance of how much do you describe and how much do you say with any character. I still struggle.
Yeah, and I know what you mean, many observers have said, great writers have talked about dialogue as a form of action, which I think is a great way to kind of think about it. As a young writer, is that it's not just an exchange; it has to be a form of action in the nature of the story, and kind of that helps you kind of raise the stakes in a way of what's being said. I find that for me, with the things you're talking about, the setup of a person and the dialogue itself, I end up taking away a lot of the description in advance of who they are and what they are, and I take away a third of the dialogue. Because you're trying to get down to the point where the very lean exchange carries that information that you used to describe, and where the pace of the exchange is coming very fast. And I was wondering, but for you in the editing process, do you find that the dialogue is shrinking to its advantage, or are you adding to it in an exchange?
Always shrinking.
Yeah,
always
right.
shrinking.
Yeah.
I shrink every day. When I start writing each day, I go back and read what I wrote the day before, and I do that because it gets me into the rhythm of when you write suspense, pacing is really, really crucial. Okay, you got to keep the reader hooked. You have to keep the pages flying by. Your story's got to move, and that's what I write, is suspense. And so to get back into the flow of it, I read what I wrote the day before, and I read it slowly, and a lot of it I read out loud. But in doing that, I make a lot of corrections, and I'm always looking for things to cut. People, we have no limits to how many words we can put in a novel. No one's going to tell us, you can't 500-page max or 300-page max. It doesn't work that way. We have unlimited space, which is not a good thing. I think we all use too many words. I think we all overwrite because we love to write, and we love to describe the character even more fully, or the situation, or the scene, or the dialogue. It's just a temptation. And once you sell a lot of books, fortunately you and I have, you can get by with a lot of stuff, and you can write all you want. So that's why, the books need to get shorter, not longer, for all of us. But I'm always struggling with how can I what can I cut? But we always need to cut more and more and more, because most books are, in my opinion, are just too long.
I
And I
like
say
that.
that because this is your longest book ever. This is
Yeah, yeah.
your thickest book ever.
It was going to be 1,000 pages. I really cut it back for you, John. But John, I like the way your the notion. I love the image that you are basically starting your day by taking things away from yesterday, right? And that is a
Yeah.
perfect piece of advice for a young writer, which is start every day
Every day.
by reading yesterday's work and making it shorter before you start adding to the
Yeah.
new pages. Now, with that,
Yeah.
Julie, maybe can we take some questions from the floor, and Julie's going to oversee that for us. And John, I'd love to keep the back half of this as a shared conversation, the one that we're in right now, which is we'll tackle whatever questions are together.
We do have some that are for both, so that's going to work out perfect. So, but the first one, Amor, and there's an upvoting thing that people are doing, so they're upvoted a couple. And let me tell people that are watching, we've gotten way too many questions that we can get to, but we'll get to as many as we can. So, go ahead.
Can I say one, Julie? And this is not an advertisement, but if you go, we would love to answer all the questions if we had time. We don't. If you go to amortowles.com, at the contact page, you can send me any question that if you have a serious question that wasn't reached tonight, send me an email and I will respond to it. And as I say, it's not an advertisement. I don't charge you for it.
Yeah.
But if you
And
have
also,
a serious question,
and we
feel
are
free.
recording this, and everybody who's in here tonight is going to get it, because there were some questions that you answered towards the beginning, so people can go back and get the answers to those.
Go ahead.
So here we go. So first question off the top is, and of course it's going to so this is from Bay. Was it hard for you to leave the world of A Gentleman in Moscow? And you kind of answered this a little bit. How long did it take you to conceive the new book?
Yeah, and I am going to ask John to talk about this too, because I'm interested in how he thinks about this. Because John is writing in a greater frequency than I am, and which we all benefit from, but as readers. But so for me, I spend 4 years, let's say, or 4 to 5 years working on something. So there's a natural desire when I exit project, B, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do next, to shoot off in a new direction? So I've been trapped in a hotel over 30 years, and I'm thinking about what am I going to do next? How about that story, which is, a bunch of boys, on a trip over 10 days? That's a natural thing to kind of, it allows me to pivot and have a new experience. And the idea of writing a book after, a guy trapped in a hotel and then writing another sedentary book of a person trapped in a place, you'd go crazy, so would my readers. So I do shift that way. For you, John, when you're in the frequency you're writing, like your decision, and by the way, so this is John's new book, which is a great page turning book. It's a little harrowing in a great way. The Judge's List, which is coming out in about 2 weeks. And this is, you return to an old character here. So when you're trying to decide, what do I do next? Do you have some version of what you did last defines to some degree what you do next? Are you looking to go in a different direction? Are you building on something that you were working on in the previous book? How do you think about the shift from one book to the next?
The last book does not impact the next book. I live in a world of lawyers, laws, law firms, judges, courts, trials, trends in litigation. That's my interest. I was a lawyer for 10 years. I still love the law and think in the law and live with the law and read the law. And when you study lawyers and courts and trials and things like that, the material is endless. The issues that we face on the criminal justice side and the civil justice side, there's so many stories. And I have a list of stories that I want to write before I die. Okay, it's a long list, and I probably won't get to them, but there are a lot of ideas that just come up. And you take an idea, a case, a trial, a law firm blows up, or a partner steals all the money, whatever, all these great stories. And you kind of route that through a hyperactive imagination. And there's just almost no end to the potential stories. And so my issue has been for 30 years, not do I have a book to write next, but which book will I pick to write next? And I'm thankful for that. I've never had a day of writer's block in my 30-year career, 35-year career of writing. And if it happens one day, I'll probably quit. But right now, there's just so many issues. It's so many stories. Now, some of the books are more serious. Some of the books deal with wrongful convictions and death penalty and mass incarceration and all these issues that I care about on the criminal justice side, and those are a bit heavier. And so sometimes I get tired of, the seriousness of some of these stories, and I'll write just an old-fashioned, entertaining suspense novel like The Judge's List, because there's no real pressing issue there. There's no criminal injustice issue there. It's just a good suspenseful story. So I go back and forth and back and forth, and I'm still having way too much fun doing this anymore. I can't believe after 45 books, I'm still having this much fun.
This is actually could be for both of you as well. And Pamela is asking, so Amor, we'll start with you, and then John will go to you on this one. Pamela is asking, at what point do you know how your novel will end?
For me, it's long before I sit down to write it. So, I think that there are some, books where my experience as a young reader was that in reading a wide array of books, is that there were some books that kind of went like this, that they started in this wonderful way. There was a great premise or a great, conceit, an action occurs or an event, or there's a great personality talking at you or whatever. And sometimes with a book, it kind of feels like it's growing out of that, but then it just kind of keeps going, drifting and wandering. And in the second half, you're like, what happened?
Where'd I go?
Where did this all go? And so I read enough of those at a certain age that made me anxious. So I kind of try to do this instead. I'm very interested in knowing where this whole thing is going. And so I have the final, what happens in the final 10 pages of a book, I know long before I'm writing chapter 1. And in fact, a lot of the process for me of designing the book is kind of thinking backwards from that. What are the things that matter in the interactions of the characters and what they're doing and what they're talking about, what they're feeling in this inevitable trajectory towards some sort of concluding point.
And the way that you formatted this one was brilliant.
Thank you.
Can't wait for everybody because I loved that. I love that.
Yes, this is a special. This book has a very specific version of that.
Yeah.
John, do you know
John,
the
how
end?
about you? Do you know the end?
I can't remember do you know it?
Yeah, one of my, I have a list of rules, my do's and don'ts for writing popular fiction, and one of my most important rules is do not write the first scene until you know the last scene, and that's true. And I know how it's going to end before I start. Writers are notorious for having a brilliant idea and jumping into the book and writing like crazy for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, a year, writing 50,000 words, and then stopping and realizing they can't get to the end. They've written themselves into a corner. They don't know what's going to happen next, and they've wasted a year. That happens all the time to writers, and I'm just too lazy to waste that much time. So before I start the book, I've got a pretty good outline of the story, and I know what the last scene is going to be, and that's a hard and fast rule that I haven't violated in many, many years.
Because I think that's the thing that you see when writers do that, because all of a sudden the ending just kind of gets wrapped up in this, like, sometimes a weird way, and you're going, okay, they just didn't probably know where they were going here. Okay.
Julie, let me say this. If you want to see the importance and the success of careful planning and outlining and pure old-fashioned storytelling and how it should be done, read The Lincoln Highway, because it's just a masterpiece of how you should structure a novel. It's just brilliantly done.
It really is. I agree wholeheartedly.
Very nice.
The structure is amazing.
And I appreciate the compliment. But when I was just thinking, as before you said that in the American canon, one of the great examples, because he had to, I don't know this for sure, but Moby Dick, Herman Melville must have known and visualized the ending, because it's in the symmetry of the book that it opens with call me Ishmael, and he's telling the story of this adventure in the sea and all the crazy things that happen, and in the end, Is this considered a spoiler if the book is almost 200 years old? But in the end, it's just him in the on the ocean holding on to a coffin that has been built the entire time of over the course of the book. So I'm sure Melville knew exactly where this was all going to end. In the extraordinary final 30 pages of Moby Dick, I'm sure he had that at the, before he even began.
Amor, I'm sorry, I never got that far. It was a spoiler alert. You just told me how it ended.
I've ruined it for you.
I've tried several times. I just can't get that far. Okay,
John,
sorry.
from now on, I want you to say, I was going to read Moby Dick, but Towles ruined the ending for me. You can blame it on me from now on.
So fantastic. That'll be great at a cocktail party. No, there's a few people that have this kind of a similar question, and it's for both of you again. Both of you had extensive careers in other places, in other areas of the world, law and finance. Was there a fear factor when you jumped into writing? How did your previous careers influence your writing? John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would never have written the first word had I not been a lawyer. I didn't study writing. I never took a course in creative writing. I never dreamed of being a writer. I was always a big reader, loved reading as a kid. Still read a lot. It didn't hit until I was 30 years old, and I saw something in a courtroom one day that inspired me to create a courtroom drama in my mind, and the writing became a secret hobby that no one knew about but my wife, and that went on for 3 years. And she read the book chapter by chapter. That became my first novel. But I've often wondered, if I had not been a lawyer, had I not been in that courtroom at that moment and seen this scene, would I have ever written the first word? I doubt I would have. It was not a dream. But now that it's happened, once I started writing full time, the legal background is still enormously beneficial to me as a writer, because it's where I find the stories. And also it adds a layer of authenticity that is often missing in books about lawyers and courtroom dramas. I can read a book in 10 pages and tell you if the writer is a lawyer, because there's just certain things you can spot if they're not a lawyer. They make mistakes, okay? So the legal background has been enormously beneficial to me.
John, I know not everybody who's listening tonight knows this story, although many. Can you share your experience with the first book coming out versus the second book coming out? Because I think that's an amazing thing about your trajectory and having a career and being a lawyer, writing this book, investing the time, but having it come out. What was the difference between book one and book two?
Well, The Time to Kill was the first book. It came out in 1989, a small unknown publisher in New York. And I was a small, very, very unknown writer from a small town in Mississippi. And I didn't have a chance. The book was a total flop. They printed 5,000 hardback copies, and we couldn't give the book away. It's so well right around Memphis where I lived, and that was it. Nobody else bought the book. By then, though, after 3 years, I was very much into the habit of writing every morning, very early in the mornings. And I had a wonderful idea for a book that was much more accessible and more potentially more commercial. And so I wrote the second book, and that became The Firm. And The Firm, when it was published 30 years ago in 1991, it found a big market overnight, became a big success, and that changed everything. And then once The Firm was popular, people realized there was an earlier book. It wasn't, it was not in print, but there was a demand suddenly for Time to Kill, and it became a bestseller too. So it was just it was a very special time that we lived through, and there was a lot of luck involved too.
Well, the reason I ask you to share that too, John, is because there are a lot of people who you have the career and you write the book on the side, as you say, in private, it's in secret. You end up with a small publisher. It doesn't do well. For a lot of people, that would have been the end. You would have said, okay, I'm a lawyer, not a writer, and so, but anyway, we're lucky you didn't do that. But, that you were like, you know what, I'm going to keep at it, so anyway, thanks for that. Thanks for doing that.
How about for you, Amor, the influence of the fight, like that switch? Was there a fear in jumping over?
The fear was not in becoming a writer. The fear was in failing to do so, because I wanted to be a writer since I was a kid, And when I'd written in high school, I'd written in college, I'd written in graduate school, I moved to New York with the intention of being a novelist, but I was, in a illegal sublet in East Village and didn't have any money and was lonely. So I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm, and 20 years later, we were still working side by side. And it was a great, great career. But along the way, and I love my clients and my colleagues and our craft, I loved everything about it. But along the way, I knew that if I did not get back and write a book I felt good about, that I would probably end up bitter and a drinker. That's where that's where I was going to end up, as opposed to just, but so it was the fear of failing to fulfill my, childhood dream and my sense that I could do this. That's what drove me to kind of say, okay, listen, I got to clear some time, said it to my wife, sweetie, I got to clear some time because, you're not going to want to be married to me later if I don't take a stab at this and, and write a book that I care about.
Was there a professor or somebody that influenced you in that decision?
Yes. And when I was in college, the novelist and nonfiction writer Peter Matheson, who's a great American writer, came to visit Yale. I got into his seminar, and he really, he specifically what happened is that he asked me to stay after class one day and said, I think that based on the last couple of stories I've read, I think that I don't know who you are. I don't know why you're here. I don't know what you want. I don't know what you want to do with your life, but I think that you might be gifted at this. And so I'm going to take your time here very seriously. And I hope that you will take your time with me very seriously too. And so I had a very close working relationship with him, and he was very disappointed when I ended up, becoming an investor. And he just was always there, kind of in a good way, haunting me, sort of, I would run into him, and he'd be like, so yeah, you're still doing that thing, huh? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Keep up the good work. All right. Whatever, one day, maybe you'll write a book. And he was just so visibly disappointed. So I knew like that was another driving force. It's good to have, I call him, he was like my Jacob Marley, with banging on my door and shaking the chains, Amor,
Did he end up knowing about Rules of Civility?
Yeah, he died a few years ago, but he was alive when Rules of Civility came out, and we still knew each other, and that was a lucky break for me, because it would have been I would have been very sad to have failed to fulfill his confidence in me while in a way that he could see it.
I think we have time for one more question, and it'll be for both of you. A gentleman in Moscow, this is from Christine. A gentleman in Moscow has a cherished place on her bookshelf. When this is for both of you, and Amor, we'll start with you on this one. Do you have a few cherished books, and what are those?
I do. A lot of them are right behind me. I like to, I keep what I admire very close at hand. And so I Moby Dick is back here. Sorry, John. But I'm a big lover of Conrad, of Faulkner, of Edith Wharton. They're all here behind me. Probably the three books that are my favorite novels are Moby Dick, 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, and War and Peace by Tolstoy. And yes, what they share in common is they are all big books, but I just admire them so much for the scope of what those three authors achieved in terms of the richness of imagination and the poetry of their language and the scope of those works.
John?
We were living in Oxford, Mississippi 30 years ago, and a gentleman that we came to know had a very rare book that he wanted to sell. It was called, it was William Faulkner's first collection, self-published collection of poetry called The Marble Faun. It's very rare. And he wanted a lot of money for it, and I wasn't going to pay it. And so my wife, Renee, sneaked around behind my back and bought the book as a Christmas gift for me in 1991, 92. And that was my first really rare book. And it created this interest and desire to start collecting rare first editions of 20th century American authors. And so I've done that for 30 years. And I've got a nice collection that I treasure and keep adding to all the time. But I love to get I have almost all of Faulkner's. There are a lot of them. I have most of Fitzgerald's, most of Steinbeck's, most of Hemingway's, and I'm a fairly active collector. I don't trade them. I don't sell them. So that's the only thing in life I collect, and I really enjoy the rare books.
Fantastic. Awesome. Gentlemen, this has been amazing. I want to leave with one thing, Amor, and I leave our audience with one thing, one final word from you. What do you want people to take away from the Lincoln Highway?
Oh, I don't write a book with the hopes that readers are going to take away a particular thing. I really do try to create a work with enough richness, enough complexity, and that it's engaging, entertaining too, but enough richness, complexity, enough layers that different people can read it and walk away with different impressions, different favorite characters, a different sense of what the book means. And nothing makes me happier than to bring 4 people together who have a different view of why they like the book or a book of mine and what it means to them. And that to me is the real achievement. If there were one thing, then I would have probably fallen short of what my goals were.
John, thank you so much for your time. Can't wait. 2 more weeks. We gotta wait.
Yeah, 2 more weeks.
Thank you, Julie. 2
Thank
more
you.
weeks.
And
Enjoyed it.
Thanks everybody for dialing in. Thank you, John. You're gracious as always. And thank you everybody for dialing in tonight and joining the 2 of us.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you to all the bookstores, and go buy your copies of both Amor and John's book. See you.
Thank you.